just needed to be age appropriate.
I'd like to introduce
Age appropriate.
Jennifer McWilliams, who is the country's leading expert on how social emotional learning programs have infiltrated every school district in America. In September of 2019, she started to inform parents and citizens about the concerning changes in the education system. In February of 2020, Jennifer was fired for exposing the social emotional learning program at her school. She now has an ongoing federal First Amendment case to defend her right to free speech. Today, Jennifer travels across America educating and consulting organizations, law firms, parental groups, and elected officials on how to fight this radical program. She is the author of she is an author at The American Mind and a consultant for Center for Renewing America. Jennifer is a member of the Teacher Ambassadors for Kids and Country. Please help me with a very warm welcome for our first speaker, Mrs. Jennifer McWilliams.
Hello. So, thank you so much for having me. I understand that this is a concerning and heated topic, but I am thankful for the ability to give voice to this, my opinion, and everyone's opinion, including ones that may not align with mine. So, I do want to say though, nobody is afraid. Nobody is afraid of the other side, the other story. What we are doing is we are standing to fight for our children and our right. It's not about being afraid. It's about you're the parent and you get to raise your child. That's what it's about. Okay, so I'm going to give you an overview of what's happening in the education system, and clearly many of you realize there's something going on. That's why you're here, right? That's why we are having this. That's why you brought me to this beautiful town, by the way. I've never been here, and what an amazing little town that we need to preserve, clearly. It's beautiful. So what I'm going to do is tell you why this is happening, why every day, if you get on social media, you get on to see what's going on in the news, you hear people talking, why is it that everyone is saying what's going on with our education system? I'm going to explain to you what has happened to the education system in the last few years. And the problem that has happened is called social emotional learning. Okay? And social emotional learning sounds nice. Everybody wants their children to learn socially and emotionally how to manage their lives and be successful in the world. But the problem is with social emotional learning, they took those terms and they redefined them in a way that often does not align with what people want their children to learn and value. And that is why I say we're fighting for our right to teach our own children and not a government institution. They don't have the right to do that. So I'm going to explain how this works. Social emotional learning is the complete transformation of our education system to psychologically manipulate this generation of children to believe critical race theory as objective truth. SEL is a thought reform program that undermines parents and replaces them with the government, and that is the problem that we have. Okay? Critical race theory, if you want to teach your own children that theory as an objective truth, that is your right to do as a parent. But our government should not be teaching that. Essentially, our government is using this as a thought reform program to literally dismantle the country that we value and the rights that we have. And I will show you how. Very quickly, I do not go into critical race theory a lot, and I'm sure a lot of you already understand this, but I'm going to give you an extremely brief explanation of it because you cannot understand critical race theory if you do not understand social emotional learning. So, critical race theory is the idea that our country was founded on racism and oppression from the beginning. The reason that we have everything, every system that we have, every institution, everything that we have, our Constitution included, was set up only to uphold white supremacy. That's the foundation of critical race theory. And within critical race theory, within the kindergarten through 12th public education system, they also heavily rely on this intersectionality wheel. Okay, and I'm going to explain this. So there are categories. You can pull this up online, and there are wheels that are very intricate. You can really divide people up as many times as you want, but this is a basic one just so that you can understand. If you're a critical race theorist, you believe that every person falls in a category of each of the, or falls somewhere in a category of each of these: race, gender, sexual orientation, documented, undocumented, religion, ability status, socioeconomic status, country of origin, age, education, language, geographic location. And depending on where you lie within each of those categories, a critical race theorist believes that you fall somewhere on a hierarchy of privileged and oppressed in our country. It doesn't matter who you are. It doesn't matter what you do. It doesn't matter your values, what you do for society, how you treat people. None of those things matter. What matters to someone that believes in critical race theory is these categories. And again, depending on where you fall within each of these categories, you fall somewhere on a hierarchy in our country of oppressed and privileged. And so the things that are coming out of the education system right now are based on those two ideas: the categories and where you fall, and the idea that our country is founded on racism and oppression. And that when you hear them tell you we need to dismantle inequitable systems, it's important to realize a critical race theorist believes the foundation of our country is inequitable. Therefore, they have to take down every system in our country. What they're talking about, and what they're teaching the children, is to dismantle America.
Yes. And then what?
Yeah. But social emotional learning, I will explain how it works in the education system, but to me this actually says, to some people, I could probably just shut this down at this point after this slide. Social emotional learning supporters. There are many of them, but I'm going to name some of the big ones. The Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative, Southern Poverty Law Center, United Nations, National Equity Project, World Economic Forum, Planned Parenthood, and the National Education Association, the Teachers Union. The one here in the corner that I skipped is called the Fetzer Institute, and that might be the one that you have not heard of. I will give you just a very brief explanation of the Fetzer Institute. The Fetzer Institute was founded by a man by the name of John Fetzer. And he was a very successful man. He was big in radio. He owned the Detroit Tigers. He was very, very wealthy. But a lot of people didn't know that his passion in life was to spread his spirituality. He was a devout follower of a woman by the name of Alice Bailey. Alice Bailey is known as the mother of the New Age spiritual occult movement. And she believed in a one world, global spiritual movement. Nothing I'm saying to you this is all, you can look it all up. It's all fact, and I have more information on my website just to give you some context. But John believed heavily in Alice Bailey and her spirituality and experimentation with occult practices. So what he did was he took his wealth and he founded the Fetzer Institute. And the Fetzer Institute is in Michigan, and the entire purpose of the Institute, the mission and vision of that Institute, is to spread a one world global spiritual movement. In 1994, they brought education leaders, specific education leaders that they knew would help push this, to the Fetzer Institute, and they had a meeting, and at that meeting, that is where they coined the term social emotional learning, and they founded the housing unit that I'll talk about more in a minute, but called CASEL, the Collaborative for Academic, Social, and Emotional Learning. So social emotional learning and housing unit that really controls all the strings, CASEL, were founded at the Fetzer Institute. The Fetzer Institute, in their theory of change, their documentation for what they're trying to accomplish, says in their theory of change that they needed, in order to carry out this mission, they needed an entry point into the education system that was innocuous, and once they were able to get that entry point, they would start spreading this new spirituality. That entry point was social emotional learning. Now, if I come across anybody that wants to practice that in their own home, I believe in America. You go right ahead. But our government is violating our Constitution, undermining parents, and seriously harming our children by supporting this. And it's not okay. Again, you can get more information on that on my website, but I think that's a really good point to give people, because nobody's crazy. This is an entire agenda that has been pushed into the education system, and I can prove it. So, social and emotional learning programs, one of the things that is extremely confusing for people is that there are over 100 social and emotional learning programs in our country that schools use. So I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, but I took a job in 2019, very small school in Indiana, and when I realized what was happening, I spoke out against it in my own time, but I opposed it. I said, what are we doing? We don't have the right to teach children morals, values, attitudes, beliefs. That is a parent's job. Again, whether or not the parent agrees with the way I do it or not, I am talking about America. And so I spoke out against it, and they fired me for it in 2020. When I started to get attention for it, and I was trying to speak out and say, well, I was speaking out against social emotional learning, I found very quickly that people had no idea what I was talking about. First of all, they didn't know what social emotional learning was. And then secondly, even when I explained it to people, they believed it wasn't happening in their school district. And the reason is because they have 100 programs, and it's all on purpose to deceive you so that it's very difficult to track. Some of the school that I was fired from used a program called The Leader in Me. There is, these are only a few, but conscious discipline. Second Step is a massive one. It's in every state. Mind Up, Pathways. There's a Michigan Model for Health, Tools of the Mind. But again, there are over 100 of them. So if your school, these don't ring a bell, just ask them if they're using social emotional learning. Because here is what is important. It's not the name of these programs. What's important is that they all follow the same framework. And that framework comes from CASEL, the organization that was founded at the Fetzer Institute. If you dig into your state education department in social emotional learning, at somewhere you will find CASEL referenced, and you will find this framework. If your school has a SEL program, and it wasn't listed in the very few that I had listed, It doesn't matter. Look into that website, do a little digging, a little bit of clicking, and you'll find this. This is where the focus needs to be. But they use all of those programs in the deception of language to deceive people. So don't be deceived by it. This is the problem, and it looks very nice, right? So I'm going to explain this to you. This is the framework that social emotional learning operates on in your school. What they said was that back in '94, they said, parents are very busy, so they don't have time to teach their children the basic life skills that they need to be successful in life. So we need to do it for them. So we're going to teach the children self-awareness, self-management, responsible decision-making, relationship skills, and social awareness. Those are the 5 competencies that they say they are going to teach your children with social emotional learning. Now, do you want your children to have those skills in life? Of course. Of course you do. But by whose standards are they being delivered through the school? Not mine. These competencies are being delivered to your children through what they call an equity lens. When you hear equity lens, that means through the viewpoint of someone that believes in the critical race theory viewpoint, that believes that our country is systemically racist and oppressive. And when you deliver anything through an equity lens, the purpose of that is to get whoever you're delivering it to, and in this case it's your children, to understand that theory as truth. So when they talk about teaching these skills to your children, it is not in the way that many Americans would teach their children, but they sound nice. They purposely use language like this. It's very innocuous, it's very deceptive, and they do it because look where we're at right now. If they came out 8 years ago, and instead of these competencies, they said, we're going to teach your children the life skills they need. White supremacy, whatever, name any of it, right? Racism, oppression, vote for reparations. They would have never got this far. But they're teaching them through that lens because it sounds nice and it got away from everyone. So it got away from everyone, all of us. But the game's up. So these competencies are delivered through social emotional learning through an equity lens. So don't be confused by the words, understand what they're doing. The way that this works is they will talk about, if you look into social emotional learning in K through 12, they will talk about how they're going to teach these competencies in every grade. They will have lessons and emphasis on all of them in every grade. But there's an extremely heavy influence on the orange, which is self-awareness and self-management in the lower grades. And the reason that they focus on this is because in order to shift what they call, their words, the consciousness of the children to understand and believe in this objective truth that they're trying to push, objective truth. You must get very young children to understand that they have an identity and that their identity means something in society and they're either privileged or they're oppressed. You have to get children to understand that. So right now when you get on social media or wherever you're seeing the problems, it's small problems. It's not small, but problems here, problems there, problems there. But what they're doing, like if they're reading kindergarten, first graders, books about pronouns, they're trying to get them to understand what is my identity. Because they want them to start understanding that they have a responsibility in society. Once you get a child or anyone to understand what your identity is, you move them over to responsible decision making. And the responsible decisions that they're pushing on children are not the responsible decisions I want my children to understand. It's responsible decisions based on, are you privileged? Or are you oppressed, and the responsible decision means you act accordingly? That's what they're doing. So when they read stories to these children, these controversial lessons, this emphasis on things that you don't want your children to have an emphasis on, it's because they're trying to play social emotional learning. They're exploiting these young, innocent children, their emotions, their natural, their natural empathy, their innocence, and they're exploiting it. Because you can go up to any child and say, whatever you want, and you'll say, do you think this is fair? And of course children are going to say no, because what do we do with children when they're very little? We say, share your toy, do all this. They're exploiting these children. Once they're making decisions based on that, you move them around to relationship skills and social awareness. There's a heavy emphasis on this, and notice it's green. That's where they want them. There's a heavy emphasis on this in the higher grades because this is where they train the activists. This is where they do lessons, and they push the idea of what are you going to do about it? You live in America, now you understand, you have an identity, you understand that there's oppression in our country of the systems, now what are you going to do about it? This is where they train the activists. Reality intervention. Social emotional learning changes the way that students learn by implementing a political teaching method that develops a radical ideology viewpoint of the world. Social emotional learning was a systemic change. So when they brought this in, across the country, it came in around 2016. There were a few districts that had a little bit before that were piloted, but most, at least 90% of the public education system in America had it by 2016. It was a systemic change because what they did was they looked at the statistics of achievement gaps, and instead of saying, they could have had there's a lot of reasons you can put on that, but what they said was, well, it's because you're racist. So we have to have a systemic change to fix it. That's what they did. So they changed the way that they teach. This is how they train students that go to college, and this has been going on for a long time. I didn't graduate yesterday, and I have this training as well. Culture responsive teaching. Students must develop a broader socio-political consciousness that allows them to critique the cultural norms, values, mores, and institutions that produce and maintain social inequities. This is the teaching method for every subject that they are pushing. This is an activist political method, and it is not their job. Culture responsive teaching, which is CRT, the other CRT, it's the praxis of critical race theory, uses lessons as a way to engage students in conversations around systemic privilege and oppression. And one of the things that they do heavily, and that's why there's a lot of focus on the books right now, is that they use one of the tenets of critical race theory called counter storytelling. So they have replaced the resources and the materials in the education system that teachers can use with counter storytelling. So basically whatever you were told as you were growing up, especially anything that values America, they are now flooding the system with resources and materials that are counter storytelling the opposite of that. That's why you are seeing all of this divisiveness in the books and the resources. It's because they are it's a brainwashing program. It is a 12-year brainwashing thought reform program, and they're trying to shift, again, this is their words, the consciousness of the children. And if you remember what I said in the beginning, they already determined, parents, you can't parent. You can't even teach the basic life skills that you need for your children to be successful. You certainly cannot make medical decisions for your children if you can't teach basic life skills. Culturally responsive teaching exploits the experiences and emotions of children. I want to give you an example because it's often very difficult for people. It's easy if you see a worksheet that talks blatantly about what's going on. And you know, thank goodness that they put some of that out there because it helps people realize. But what people can't do and can't see and can't get their hands on is this method of teaching. So culturally responsive teaching is supposed to be used in every subject. You will also, if you go to your, at least state department, depends on how on top of things your school district is, but you will also hear them talk about cultural competence. Okay, so when they talk about that, they're talking about the environment also shifting and the culture of the school shifting to this idea. And I'm going to give you an example. You could give me any lesson that you could think this is impossible for her to turn this around. I can do it. I wish I couldn't, but I can. This is what you can't get your hands on, parents. I'm going to give you, this would be like a second grade math problem. Johnny was on the way to an amusement park with his mom and dad. The park was a total of 50 miles away. They already drove 20 miles. How many more miles do they need to drive? Everybody in this room can at least say, yep, that sounds like something I had when I was in school. But if you are a culturally responsive teacher, you'll use this lesson to start to shift the consciousness of the children. And this is how you would do it. I would give it to my second grade classroom, and I would say, well, you know, kids would raise their hand, and I'd be like, let's not worry about the answer right now. They don't need to know math, really. They have Google. That's what they would tell you. But let's talk about this children, right? So Johnny's on the way to an amusement park with his mom and dad. How many of you have been to an amusement park? I see a lot of you have been to the amusement park. But some of you haven't. Why would it be that some of you have not been to the amusement park? You might have a kid say, my friend doesn't like the amusement park, scared of the rides. Right? And then you think, sure, that would be a good reason. But if you're culture responsive, you continue to dig and push until you get what you want to push this idea. And you say, well, what's another reason? Now remember, you're talking about second grade, 7, 8 years old. What's another reason? I could get a whole room. You could give me any second grade. I could get them all to come to the same conclusion. Well, because in amusement parks, some people can't afford it. You need to make them free. That's being culturally responsive. I'll give you another example. Maybe I don't want to go that route with this problem. Maybe I say, okay, let's think about this. Johnny is on the way to the park with his mom and dad. Do all families have a mom and dad? And, you know, there's going to be very innocent children that are going to go, yes. And then there's going to be other children that are going to say, well, down the street, there's 2 moms, there's 2 dads. And then you use that opportunity, if you're a culturally responsive teacher, to engage these children in that conversation and what that means. That's culturally responsive teaching. Do they ever get to the answer? Depends. They don't care. They don't care. They might. But what do you see when your child comes home? You see this. You see this. You're not seeing what I'm talking about because you can't see it. So the counter storytelling, another part of social emotional learning is this massive culture shift within the schools, which clearly you are all aware of. But they had to flood the resources and materials with the counter stories. And so they do it in the libraries, in online apps, in any resource. Everybody needs to pay attention to the curriculum. But if you have curriculum transparency, it's not even close to enough. They want you to look at that. They want you to focus on the curriculum because social emotional learning is not curriculum. It's not a curriculum. They want you to focus on curriculum because the library books don't count as curriculum. They want you to focus on curriculum because the third-party resources and materials and apps that the teachers can use and have access to do not count as curriculum. So that's where they're flooding it in. And when you go and you ask the school, I want to, have access to this and see all of the materials for those third-party programs, maybe social emotional learning, whatever it is, most of the time they're going to deny you because it's protected under third-party proprietary materials, and that's done on purpose. So that is something that has to be changed, and people need to understand. I every week hear from someone saying, I appreciate what you're doing, but I feel pretty good about what's going on because we have curriculum transparency, and then I have to break the news to them that that's what they want you to think. So in the libraries, you will find a massive increase of books like this. If you have access, if you have a child in school, you will have access to this. But even if you don't, a lot of times they'll have it online. And you push at the school boards, you don't let them take it offline so that anybody can see this and people need to watch this. But they will be flooding the library with books for younger kids like these. They, she, he, easy as ABC, My Princess Boy, Heather Has Two Mommies, A Tale of Two Daddies, and these books are not used as an isolated lesson. They want them to just be part of the culture. This is part of the culture shift. If somebody wants to teach their children this, fine. But our government doing it, they're undermining parents. And they're doing it because they know that this will separate them from you. It will separate your children from you. The different dragon, I just wanted to point out because it is not clear what it is, and I want people to realize you have to open the book. This is also about a same-sex marriage, and so just make sure you're not only looking at the cover. When you get to the higher grades, there will be a lot of books that will push the idea of privilege and oppression, or they will push the idea of gender ideology and sexual preference. These books stamped The Hate You Give push the idea that our country is systemically racist. It floods emotions in these books to get kids angry and put them against each other. The one in the middle, Sex, the All You Need to Know Sexuality Guide to Get You Through Your Teens and 20s. The books that are coming into the library, there's 43 states in our country that have what's called a loophole. And you could give this book, as an adult, you can hand a book to a child on the street, and in 43 states you would be arrested and charged with a felony for giving pornography to a minor. But our education system does it through the loophole under the guise of education. And there's nothing educational about it. It is flat out pornographic. It is for conditioning and grooming children. It is making it normal. You break their inhibitions so that it's just normal. Social credit scores. Social emotional learning is collecting a massive amount of mental health data on children through surveys. This data is creating a psychological profile for students by analyzing their personality traits. That's a mouthful, and it's all true. Social emotional learning, when it comes to the school, you'll see this language, look for it. We'll say, this is great, you can't argue the data. You can't argue the statistics. This is data-driven. Well, it's data-driven, but it's based on their own data that they're coming up with so that they have talking points to push back on all of you. So when you hear these points, when you hear these statistics, don't buy it, and I'm going to show you why. When you understand it, they really are going to have a hard time arguing it. You bring social emotional learning into the school, and you have to make changes to the school because it's a systemic change like I talked about. You change a lot of things in the school. You change the way the discipline works, which actually creates more chaos. You change the teaching method. You change the resources and materials, but you make sure those things are protected from parents being able to see them. And then you use a survey. You give children a survey of very subjective questions, and you interpret it in a way that gives you the data you want, so then you can go, social emotional learning is working. So I think I saw a sign out there. Social emotional learning is good for the students. Well, that person holding that sign must have seen all that data, because they are interpreting the data to get the results they want, to continue pushing this on you, and to put a barrier between you, how you argue with the data. I'll show you how. So the data is what we call a self-fulfilling prophecy. They give in-class surveys, like student data. What they'll tell you is they're going to check on the climate of the school, or we just want to check on all those kids and see how we can improve the school, or we want to check on how our program is going, so we just want to take a survey. That's what they'll tell you. You interpret the data through an equity lens. Okay? The equity lens is through the viewpoint of someone who believes our country is oppressive. Those results are stored and evaluated on every child. If you have a child in the public education system right now, the government has a psychological profile that they've been building on them. These surveys actually are clusters of questions that they use to profile their personality traits, and it's stored by our government. The results require changes to the school culture, and then the students are radicalized by those changes, and then you start the process over. And this is a never-ending cycle. They will do this until they run these schools off of the cliff. I'm going to give you an example. This is actually one of the questions. And so, again, they play games with the words. So if you go in there and you say, I want to see this survey, I'm going to determine for myself if it's okay. That's fine and that's good, but understand what they're doing with it. Because this question doesn't sound bad. How confident are you that you can complete all the work that is assigned in your classes? First of all, if you're a good teacher, you're going to know if your kids feel confident about that. You don't need a survey. But that question doesn't sound bad. But what they do is they put it through an equity lens. And this is what that equity lens would determine. The scores indicate school culture is suppressing their ability to complete work. So what do? You have to make a change. It's a systemic change. It's for the collective good. So the intervention, because of that data, would be increase counseling services for students with lower scores to investigate ways to improve school culture. Bring in more Black Lives Matter, LGBTQ representation, flags, and clubs. Add more social justice and sexuality books to the library. And then when you have parents come to school and say, what the heck are you doing? You hold up your fraudulent data and say, nope, we have the data. This should be terrifying. And this is the one issue when I talk about social emotional learning, that it doesn't matter what, if you're from the right, left, center, you know nothing about politics, it doesn't matter. I can get people from across the board to agree, no, I don't want the government building a psychological profile for my child. What they're doing is they're building a social credit score for your children. And this didn't happen in the last year or 2 years. It has been in the schools since at least 2016. Some schools longer if they were a pilot school. They're going to use that data. They are going to use that data. I'll give you an example. A lot of talk right now about the Second Amendment and red flag laws. You give this a couple of years, you allow them to continue building this, and your child graduates high school, and they want to practice their Second Amendment, and they go to apply for their permit or whatever they need in the state, and they go to purchase their firearm. They're going to pull up these profiles, and they're going to say, you know what, this child had a rough couple years. 5th and 6th grade didn't go very well. We better put them on restriction. And again, based on fraudulent data, I wouldn't interpret that data that way, but our government is. All of this data is being put into, and your state has it, it's called a statewide, I'll finish up here in just a couple minutes. It's called a statewide longitudinal data system. So you can look it up for Massachusetts. Something you might notice is they will list it as P-W20. The reason they call it that is because these scores are preschool through the workforce. It's a lifelong score that they're building. And you can look this up. You'll find it. And right now our government is pumping massive amounts of money to the states that the states apply for grants. Every grant that comes into your state or your school, you read it. If they're not just going to have a petting zoo outside and the kids learn about animals, tell them no. The grants are they're toxic to the school. You have to be very careful. You will see everywhere, more data, more data. This is what they're talking about. There is no reason. They don't need the grants, they don't need more money to teach real academics. They're taking in the money and then they get tied in to building more profiles for your children. Social emotional learning is a trauma-informed practice that places every child in a mental health intervention system. This system requires school counselors to work as social justice advocates who shift the school culture to emphasize racism, gender ideology, and sexual preference. This systemic change is disguised by innocuous language, such as welcoming and safe schools. When you hear welcoming and safe schools, this is what we're talking about. Because before they brought in all of this insanity, schools were welcoming and safe. They were welcoming and safe. And they took care of kids based on their individual needs if they needed them. Whether it was an academic need, a behavioral need, an emotional need. We had services for all of those needs. When they brought in social emotional learning, they decided it's not the child that we need to fix, it is the system. It's the adults. It's the parents that are bringing their kids to school. That's the problem. We have to fix the system, not the kids. So since social emotional learning is a trauma-informed practice, it placed every single child into what's called an MTSS. This is a framework that we used before social emotional learning. I'll give you a very basic example. You had a child that came to school that was dyslexic, or actually came to school with a true situation of trauma. You're adults, we all understand that happens. So we need, we want the schools to be looking out for children. They're exploiting that and taking advantage of it. Social emotional learning came in, it placed every single child, not based on an individual needs, but based on the idea that they are raised in a systemically oppressive country. Put them all into MTSS, interventions, mental health services. Social emotional learning is a tier 1 mental health service. So if you have a child in school, you didn't know that, probably. I would assume most people don't. But now they're, without your vision, giving them mental health services. The teachers push the classroom shift. The teachers use the new teaching method. Not all of them, some older teachers, but quite honestly, they're being held captive at this point. They're prisoners of this. They know it's not right. They just want to teach the children and retire. But the ones that are coming out of the colleges have been trained this way. And they don't know any different. But the school counselors, and there's always someone in the room who's like, this is not your guidance counselor. This is not, they have changed it. The school counselors, and they don't like to be called guidance counselors anymore because that implies that you're looking at a schedule and saying, well, you need to have this next history class. They changed it to be school counselors, and they, in their documentation, are now what they call social justice activists. And this is your school counselors in every single public education school. All of them. And they all follow the guidelines of a national model, even if they don't have a certificate from this place. It's called the American School Counseling Association, ASCA is what we call them. And they are responsible for pushing this massive culture shift. And I'm about done here, but this is extremely important. The school counselors are exploiting, just like everything else in social emotional learning, and taking advantage of the idea of confidentiality. If you have a child that comes to school that's truly being abused, you want people looking out for them and to report it correctly, instead of calling the parent and saying, hey, is your child being abused, right? I mean, we have to have some guards like that. But they're exploiting it. And now, instead of working with the parents, they assume that the children are coming from homes that are at risk for abuse. They assume that it's possible, right out of the gate, that you're all abusers. And I'm not talking about what we traditionally do with think of abuse. They use the confidentiality clause, and if you go to your school counselor now, and again, because it's trauma-informed, school counselors now service every child in the school, all of them. And so a child can go to that counseling service at any time, and all they have to do is say, fill in the blank. I am 15 and I'm pregnant. I'm afraid to tell my parents. Okay? They said, I'm afraid to tell my parents. Done. Now they won't tell you, because you could be the abuser. I am a boy and I think I'm a girl, but my parents don't believe me and I'm afraid to tell them. You are now the abuser. And they will hide it from you. They say the right things. We want to work with parents. But the parents they want to work with are the parents that are willing to put their children in the car and drive them to the clinic to be mutilated for the idea of transgenderism. Those are the parents they'll work with. But if your child comes to them and says, I'm afraid to tell my parents, again, fill in the blank, they can now deem you the abuser and hide it from you. And all across this country, we have children identifying as animals. We have children that go to school, and there are transition closets that the schools have clothes in, and the children can come and go by a different name, use a different restroom, a locker room, go to the closet before school starts, change their clothes, and assume a new identity, and they will not tell you. In fact, I've been involved with 2 lawsuits now, and the counselors had a meeting with all of the teachers that child had in their schedule, and said, when you talk to the parents, you use their legal name, and we are not telling them. Now you say, well, how could they do that? Because they're not actually changing the documents. That's how they do it. If they change the documents, if they actually change the legal document, they have to tell you, so they just don't. I know this sounds really out there, but this is what's happening to your children. This is what is happening. And so we have to first know what's happening, and then we have to stand up. So I'll just leave you with a call to action. Understand the language of Marxism. This is a Marxist revolution. And they're taking advantage and doing it to your children because they're innocent and they're easy targets. They can't do it to adults. Because there's too many adults that had a good education and understand what's happening. So they're doing it to your children. James Lindsay is, he has a website called New Discourses. If you want to understand, he goes into depth on all of this, but understand that what they say is not what they mean. Break down the SEL system and players. I have been fortunate to work with an organization called Courage is a Habit, and courageisahabit.org. You'll hear a little bit more about it in a minute, but they have a decoding system that will help you because the language is hard to see through. It really is. Don't give labels power. If you're an adult and you are called something and you can't stand up to it, imagine what your children are going to go through. Do not give labels power. Speak the truth. Speak what you want for your children, and don't back down. Organize and stay engaged. This is a fantastic gathering here. And honestly, Lori, thank you so much. Amazing. Because people need this information. Opt out of the surveys. You still have the right to get out of the surveys, but you need to tell everybody you know. And you have to stay on top of it. So get out of the surveys. There are still ways they will collect data, but that is a big one. And Courage is a Habit has a form for you if you go to their website that you can get that will help you understand and explain to other people why you need to get out of the surveys. Get them out of the data. Even if you want some of this to be pushed on society, get your children out of the data. They're going to use it against, it's weaponizing the government against your children. Watch the grants and contracts. Again, I made a joke earlier about the animals, but really, our schools have plenty of money. You know it because you pay taxes. They can teach academics, but they need the grant money to push this crap on your children. Stop the grants. They don't need anything else. And then bring in a lawsuit. There's many angles that you can take. I don't know if Massachusetts was one. I think maybe it was not, but I was at least fortunate over the summer in Tennessee. They were one of the states that banned critical race theory. And so we have launched a massive landmark lawsuit to sue the school district because social emotional learning is a blatant violation of the critical race theory ban. So even if you don't have it in Massachusetts, tell me one that you know that might be in a state that has it. We're hoping for a domino effect, but it also is very telling. And even if your state doesn't have the ban, it is still a violation of your parental rights. It's a violation of religious freedom. When they're asking your children to push pronouns on them, that's compelled speech. Sue the hell out of them. We're going a little bit over. I seriously thank you so much. And thank you for being here. I really appreciate it.
Good job, Ms. Wallace.